Welcome back to Ovid Through the Ages. This time we're going to be talking about Ovid's reception in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, but we're going to start with the Renaissance. So Ovid was very popular during the Renaissance, and part of this is because the humanists in the Renaissance were rediscovering antiquity. Plus they had the printing press, so this made it very easy for ancient texts to be widely circulated. This caused fields like painting to turn into mythology, especially Ovid's mythology and metamorphoses, instead of just using religion for subject matter. Also, there were masks and dramas being based on Ovid's stories and scenes during this time. Classical culture played a huge role in the outburst of creative energy that happened during the Renaissance, and Ovid was the most imitated and influential classical author in the Renaissance. I have a few quotes from a scholar named Kilgore here. He claims that to see Ovid through the humanist tradition then is to define him primarily as a resource book for stories, a toolkit for artists, full of individual and essentially autonomous myths to be pulled apart, interpreted, and reassembled freely. So basically, artists took Metamorphoses as a book and used it at free rein to reinterpret and reimagine these myths in their own creative ways. Kilgore also says from the start, Ovid had given the Renaissance artist a kind of aesthetic jolt. Also, Ovid played a particularly key and practical role in England and its Renaissance. It's only a slight exaggeration to say that Ovid is almost single-handedly responsible for English literature. As well as Elizabethan writers found their subjects, honed their wit, invented genres, and justified their obsessions about sex and art through Ovid. The English reclaimed Ovid as a symbol of their own English art, and so Ovid became synonymous with Metamorphoses as well during that period. Some medieval features persisted well into the 17th century, like the Christian allegories. However, people in the Renaissance also began to analyze Ovid and his rhetoric and his own perception of how his work would survive. So basically looking at other facets of Ovid that weren't looked at in the medieval era. He's still being used as a school text, though at this point he begins to be seen as more of a wicked pleasure. But a lot of his popularity in this era was gained by the fact that he was used as a school text in the 16th and 17th centuries. Renaissance minds were also more sensitive to Ovid's ability to unsettle our ideas about sex, gender, and our bodies. Now, Ovid is still associated with dark things at this time, like rape and violence, but he's also very strongly associated with the power of the imagination. And to talk of Ovid in this era is to use him as an allusion to both of these things, so the imagination and darker things, rape, sexual violence, and things like that. Now, his popularity took a bit of a dip around 1610, and in the late 16th century, around that time as well, people were starting to get worried that the multiplicity that Ovid kind of championed, and by multiplicity we mean that in Metamorphoses, he talks about thousands of different myths instead of focusing on a few characters. We're going to overtake the archetype of the hero and the heroic story and heroic poetry. So they were having some anxiety about that. But they also connected to Ovid again through his exile and punishment from a ruler. Because in the Elizabethan era, Queen Elizabeth would deal severe physical penalties to writers who breached their alliance to her or went against her rule by doing things like chopping off their hands. So these authors, the handless ones, would then connect to Ovid as a symbol of a literary artist who had been punished by a ruler. Also, the humanists regarded themselves as heirs to Greek and Roman culture and often thought themselves exiled from the sources of learning and civilization and culture, so they also connected Ovid's exile to that feeling that they had. So at this point, we're going to take a look at a couple of the authors who were heavily influenced by Ovid in this period. And it's important to note that not all of these authors may have studied Ovid directly, but Ovid's said to be part of the furniture of the Renaissance mind, kind of like an example we could use is like Freud and his idea of the conscious and unconscious. Like everyone just kind of knows that idea in this time and place. In the Renaissance, everyone just knew about Ovid and his ideas and his poetry. So we're going to start with Shakespeare. Shakespeare was said to be the most famous Elizabethan embodiment of Ovid and was particularly alive to all that was elegant, witty, or erotic in Ovid's poetry. Shakespeare actually wrote some of his first poems based off of Ovid's myths. And of course, once he got to his stage as the famous playwright that we know him as, he couldn't use such sexual content on the stage, but he still manages to reference Ovid. In Titus Andronicus, it's actually an extension of the tale of Philomela from Book 6 of Metamorphoses, and it's also set in late Imperial Rome, so this is pretty closely based off of Ovid. And now, there's lots of references to Ovid in Midsummer Night's Dream, which is a play that most of us know. In Midsummer, the fairies in the fairy world, Titania, Oberon, all of their underlings, they take a very specific look on morals and the way that they treat mortal beings in the world of the play, and that way that they treat them is very closely aligned to the way that the gods in Ovid's poetry treated the mortals. Also, Bottom and the Mechanicals perform a version of Pyramus and Thisbe at the wedding, and Pyramus and Thisbe is actually a myth taken directly from Ovid. Now, this is a comical kind of spoof version of it, but Shakespeare definitely took it from that play. And another more subtle reference to Ovid was Oberon does a speech about a flower called Love and Idleness and explains that it was hit by Cupid's bow and turned from white to purple. And Shakespeare is drawing this from the fact that the mulberry tree in the myth of Pyramus and Thisbe is changed by the wound of love, which Shakespeare says that Cupid's bow is, of Pyramus's blood onto the tree. So that's yet another reference to Ovid's myths. And another play, The Tempest, the protagonist, Prospero, is often compared to Medea, who's a witch in one of Ovid's myths. And he has a speech in The Tempest, which you'll see on the screen, that's almost identical to a speech that Medea makes in the myth. And it's the famous Ye Elves of Hills, Brooks, and Standing Lakes speech that Shakespeare took, at least the beginning, almost word for word from Ovid. Prospero is also compared to Ovid the poet himself in that he spins his own tale, manages his own destiny and textual identity in a way, and he often can't keep track of his side plots. Another poet that was heavily influenced by Ovid is John Milton, author of Paradise Lost. Now, in his younger days, Milton is said to have read Ovid as a break from his schoolwork, and when Milton was older, he went blind and had his daughters read him books by his bedside, and his daughter has testified that Ovid's Metamorphoses was one of the top 3 favorite books that Milton liked to have read to him in his blindness. Now, he also connected to the exile persona of Ovid in that he felt very exiled in his academic career at Cambridge, so he may have aligned to him in this way. He started writing poetry, and he wrote Latin poetry, some of his first poems, and they were also elegiac poems. So this is pretty much exactly the style of Ovid's poetry that he used to write. And Ovid is also present in his largest work, Paradise Lost, though the references to him and his impact are somewhat less obvious, especially since Paradise Lost is so rooted in Christian theology. Now, Milton receives an Ovid that has already been through the ringer of medieval Christian allegorization. So some think that Milton wanted to continue this allegory of Ovid, and some thought that he was a Renaissance humanist who wanted to reinterpret Ovid on his own terms. But either way, he is a humanist who wants to reinterpret Ovid and his epic to a Christian purpose, and his own Christian epic. So Milton draws directly on Ovid for his descriptions of the beginning of the world in Paradise Lost, and particularly for the description of the realm of chaos, which Ovid also talks about in Metamorphoses. There's also a speech, a memorable moment if you've ever read Paradise Lost, that Eve makes when she describes her birth. And she describes getting up and staring into a pool of water and seeing her own reflection and being struck by the beauty of her reflection and the woman in the pond. And if you've ever read Ovid's myth of Narcissus, this is pretty much exactly what happens to Narcissus before his downfall. Eve, as a character, has also been compared to characters from Ovid's myths: Daphne, Flora, Pomono, Venus, Pyrrha, and Proserpina. And some think that her connection with these characters, as well as with Narcissus, is foreshadowing her fall from grace. Satan, the character of Satan, is also profoundly Ovidian in his narcissistic self-image, and also the fact that he's the one character that transforms many times during the story. Now, as we know, Ovid's Metamorphoses is centered on transformations, and Satan makes a lot of them into many different animals and things and creatures during the course of Paradise Lost. Also, the character of Sin, Satan's offspring, is very closely relatable to Ovid's Scylla, and is also born of an incestuous union, and one of the main sources for writings on incest and the kind of characterization that they had of it came from Ovid's Metamorphoses, in which it's mentioned many times. And of course, the biggest transformation that takes place in Paradise Lost is the fall of Adam and Eve, and this is often compared to the transformations in Ovid's myths. Other Renaissance poets also connected with Ovid, mentioned him, imitated him, and these include Cervantes, who works Ovid into Don Quixote through stories of transformations and allusions to the myths. The Spanish poet Gongora uses bird imagery borrowed from Ovid's myths in his famous poem Solitudes. Andrew Marvell, who is perhaps the most closely, overtly Ovidian poet, references Apollo's pursuit of Daphne, Zeus's transformation in a shower of gold to woo Danae, and the fall of Paphon in his poetry. And Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Fairy Queen, refers to Ovid in a less nice way by connecting the monstrous and pagan side of Ovid and his characters to his villain Error in The Fairy Queen. Now we're going to move on to talk about the Enlightenment's reception of Ovid. Now, this was perhaps the most negative and critical period in Ovid's reception, which is quite a change from the fame that he was experiencing in the Renaissance. But this might have been because during the Enlightenment, the modern forms of literary criticism that we're used to today were just coming to be, and so they were super critical. Affection for Ovid remained widespread even through his low points and his critical reception, so people still knew him and read him. But he was much less written about, and he inspired less art during this period. He is still taught in schools, but even this took a negative turn because of the fact that young people were reading him, he began to become characterized as a poet for the young and uneducated. However, one thing that was extremely popular during this period was translations of Ovid and of other classical works, but Ovid in particular was among the most frequently translated classical poets of the Enlightenment. Some of the best-known authors, such as Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, tried their hand at translation of Ovid at some point during their careers. Perhaps the best translation known to us is Dryden and Tonson's 1717 Metamorphoses. But these translations, all of them that were produced, enjoyed the popularities akin to the early novels of the period, so people would have them and read them for leisure. There was also growing skepticism to the Christian allegorical approach to Ovid's works, and this led to new ways of reading and interpreting Ovid for those who did read at the time. They also condemned Ovid for the ambivalence they sensed in his work, and they, at this point, found the erotic content in his poems distasteful, which is strange because it had been all the vogue in the 1660s. However, the British people still recognized him as a strong part of the English tradition, and they continued to emulate them. So he was quoted in the philosophical moral essays of Samuel Johnson and Edmund Burke, and Alexander Pope, who was particularly enamored with Ovid, he writes a poem called The Rape of the Lock, and in The Rape of the Lock there is an imaginary realm called the Cave of Spleen, and he bases much of his descriptions of the Cave of Spleen on things that he takes from Ovid. And he also, as I mentioned before, did a translation of Ovid's works. And in this time, Ovid's poem Heroines is more popular than it has ever been throughout Ovid's reception. And this is probably because female literacy rates were starting to increase, and also females were starting to write more and more letters, so they were more involved in the literary arts. So they started reading Ovid and chose Heroines as one of his works that felt represented them best. But that's about it for the reception during the Enlightenment. Next episode, we're going to look at his reception in modern times, which is much more fruitful.